Chumlee, the name synonymous with the hit reality TV show Pawn Stars, was a figure recognized by just about everyone. Austin Russell, better known as Chumlee, once had it all: fame, wealth, and a life full of opportunities. With his quirky humor and offbeat personality, he charmed millions of viewers for over a decade. These were the very traits that contributed to the success of Pawn Stars, making Chumlee an icon in the entertainment world. Hey everyone! Today we're going to take a closer look at the darker side of Chumlee's life, from the highs of fame to the unexpected downfalls. What do you think about the changes in his life? Have these challenges affected you in any way? If you can relate to his story, drop a 1 in the comments. If you have a different perspective, feel free to leave a 0. Enjoy the video and don't forget to hit subscribe to support the channel. However, behind the laughter on screen, his real life was slowly falling apart, leading to a tragic end no one could have anticipated. People would soon realize that Chumlee's story wasn't just about the heights of fame, but also the devastating downfalls he couldn't escape, leaving a lasting impact not only on his own life but also on those who had followed his journey all along. In March 2016, an event occurred that completely changed Chumlee's life. Police conducted a raid on his home, stemming from an investigation into allegations of sexual assault. What initially seemed like a straightforward case quickly took a shocking turn. As authorities entered Chumlee's residence, they not only found evidence related to the sexual assault investigation, but also uncovered an unregistered collection of firearms and a significant quantity of illegal drugs. These discoveries didn't just land Chumlee in the face of serious felony charges. They sparked a lengthy legal battle that shattered the life he once knew. But how could someone like Chumlee, known for his friendliness and lovable on-screen persona, end up in such a tragic situation? Chumlee, despite the affection he received from fans, suddenly found himself trapped in a harsh reality where crime and addiction gradually took over his life. Longtime followers were left bewildered, unable to comprehend how a star who once seemed to be living the dream could lose everything so suddenly. His arrest was only the beginning of a heartbreaking chain of events. The legal proceedings that followed, filled with unexpected twists and turns, revealed a Chumlee spiraling out of control, struggling with fame, inner demons, and a series of poor decisions. As Chumlee's trial began, it felt as though his world was on the verge of collapsing. Confronted with serious charges of possessing unregistered firearms and illegal drugs, his future looked increasingly uncertain and bleak. The media coverage was relentless, filled with speculation about what would happen next, while fans of Pawn Stars watched anxiously, wondering whether the friendly star they had grown to love could escape the harsh penalties looming over him. The courtroom drama unfolded like a public spectacle, drawing the attention of millions. Each passing day seemed to add more fuel to the fire, and eventually, the moment of sentencing arrived. In a tense courtroom, Chumlee sat quietly, his eyes fixed ahead, perhaps reflecting on the chain of events that had led him to this very moment. Though the sentence had been anticipated, the judge's words still hit like a thunderbolt. A life sentence for a man who once made the world believe he was untouchable. For Chumlee's family, friends, and fans, it was a punishment almost too heavy to bear. The media, ever eager to spotlight scandal, wasted no time in capturing the emotional collapse of a man who had once been the beloved face of a favorite TV show. Chumlee's public image, once built on humor and light-hearted charm, had now faded into a distant memory, overshadowed by the harsh reality of his downfall. He was forced to confront the harsh reality of his situation, something no one could have imagined when looking at the glamorous TV star he once was. For Chumlee, the life sentence wasn't just a legal punishment, it was the end of the future he had dreamed of, the relationships he had built, and the reputation he had spent years nurturing. In that moment, everything crumbled. Fame, fortune, and the admiration of millions of fans, all of it, was now overshadowed by criminal charges and irreversible consequences. Chumlee sat there in the courtroom, the weight of it all etched deeply into his face. But this was only the beginning of an inescapable downward spiral, a tragic story that no one, not even he, could have foreseen. His rise to fame served as a textbook example of how celebrity can both elevate and destroy. Austin Russell, the son of Henderson, Nevada, could never have imagined that he would become a television star after starting his journey in the most unlikely of places, a pawn shop. As a teenager, Chumlee was hired by the Harrison family to work at the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, a family-run business that would later become the unlikely stage for his stardom. This very pawn shop would later become the iconic backdrop of Pawn Stars. With his unique sense of humor and natural ability to connect with customers, Chumlee quickly won the hearts of fans. His strong on-screen presence, coupled with his role as the lovable, comedic sidekick to Rick and Corey Harrison, earned him a special place in the hearts of viewers around the world. As fame grew, Chumlee found himself not only adored by audiences, but also burdened by immense pressure, the pressure to maintain his image, meet fan expectations, and constantly perform in front of the camera. His quirky humor and endearing clumsiness made Chumlee a standout character on Pawn Stars. But behind the scenes, that spotlight came with a cost. However, behind the smiles and humor on screen, Chumlee's life wasn't as perfect as everyone might have imagined. He began struggling with addiction, and his personal life slowly spiraled out of control. The immense pressures of fame had pushed him to the brink. The very factors that helped him become a star now seemed to become a burden. When the police raided his home, it became clear that Chumlee's struggles were far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The charges against him were extremely serious, and the upcoming trial garnered public attention, making everything even more complicated. As the legal proceedings unfolded, fans began to wonder, how could someone as beloved as Chumlee end up in such a tragic situation? Is he really the person we saw on TV? Or is there another side to Chumlee that the public had never known? The reality of the situation was more complicated than anyone could have anticipated, and it seemed that everything had spiraled beyond what he could control. As the trial continued, Chumlee's legal team worked tirelessly to negotiate a plea deal, helping him avoid a lengthy prison sentence. Instead of facing a 20-year prison sentence, Chumlee received a sentence of 3 years probation, community service, and counseling. This sentence provided an opportunity for redemption, but it also came with its own set of challenges. Chumlee now had to live under the pressure of not violating any conditions, as doing so would mean facing the possibility of being incarcerated. It seemed that Chumlee had realized his mistakes. He publicly expressed regret, thanked his fans for their support, and committed to correcting his wrongs. However, despite his promises to change, the consequences of his past actions still loomed large. As the media continued to closely follow his every move, Chumlee's once cheerful image began to fade. The man who had been a source of joy on Pawn Stars had now become a tragic figure, living under the shadow of actions he could never undo. In a heartbreaking twist, the final chapter of Chumlee's story came to a sudden and tragic end. After being sentenced, Chumlee was taken to jail, where he would face the next steps in his legal journey. But what happened next was truly devastating and shocking. Just days after hearing his sentence, Chumlee was found dead in his cell. The cause of death was determined to be suicide by hanging, a brutal final act that left his family, friends, and fans stunned. How could someone so full of life, whose laughter always made everyone around him happy, have fallen into such a tragic state? What led to his final moments? And could it have been prevented? This video takes a deep look at Chumlee's story, exploring his rise to fame, his fall from grace, and the heartbreaking end that no one could have predicted. It's a story of fame, addiction, regret, and redemption. Ultimately, this story serves as a warning about the dangers of fame and the struggles that even the most beloved stars face when the cameras stop rolling. Austin Russell, known to everyone as Chumlee, first gained public attention in a way few could have predicted. Born in Henderson, Nevada, Chumlee's rise to fame seemed almost accidental, the result of timing, personality, and opportunity. From a young age, he displayed a natural charm and easygoing personality, which made him the center of attention among friends and family. But it wasn't until he started working at the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas that his life took a sudden turn, and the spotlight began to shine on him. The gold and silver pawn shop, owned by Richard "Rick" Harrison and his family, wasn't just any ordinary pawn shop. It was a family business that served a wide range of customers, from tourists looking to sell valuable items to those with unique and rare collectibles. It was here that Chumlee first met Rick and his son Corey, beginning a relationship that would later thrust him into the public eye. Chumlee started out as a regular employee, helping customers, organizing merchandise, and learning about the ins and outs of the business. What set him apart, however, was his natural ability to entertain others. He had a special presence, always able to make people laugh, even without trying. This innate sense of humor became his ticket into the world of reality television. In 2009, Pawn Stars premiered on the History Channel, and not long after, Chumlee became a standout character on the show. With his distinct size, cheerful attitude, and entertaining interactions with both customers and co-workers, he quickly won over the audience. People loved his quirky personality, his willingness to roll with the absurdities of the pawn shop world, and his famous catchphrases. Chumlee's role on Pawn Stars was far from that of a mere side character. He quickly became the humorous companion to Rick and Corey, a constant source of laughter in a serious business. With his natural charm and unique personality, Chumlee not only captured the hearts of the audience, but also became an indispensable part of the success of Pawn Stars. His genuine charisma won over viewers, and his backstory of working in a family business and bonding with colleagues created a relatable, down-to-earth image in the public's eyes. But fame came with a heavy responsibility. While Chumlee's personality on Pawn Stars seemed effortless and down-to-earth, the pressure of being a public figure began to take a serious toll on his life. As Chumlee's popularity grew, so did the demand for his time and energy. Fans would approach him everywhere from the streets to public events, asking for autographs or photos, eager to meet the person they only saw on screen. While he was initially excited about the attention, over time, Chumlee began to feel exhausted by the constant need to face the public. The easygoing life of a pawnshop employee had turned into a life under constant surveillance, leaving him with little to no privacy. While he always maintained a cheerful, easygoing attitude, this newfound fame brought with it a level of pressure Chumlee was unprepared for. His popularity created a ripple effect, opening doors to opportunities he had never imagined. Sponsorship deals, commercial appearances, and an ever-growing social media following came at him fast. He was invited to events, featured on talk shows, and signed endorsement deals. The life that had once been confined to the pawn shop was now expanding into a vast world filled with possibilities and opportunities. However, beneath all the glitz and glamour of fame, there were darker forces simmering beneath the surface. Chumlee began to feel the pressure of maintaining the public image he had built. His weight, which was a distinctive part of Chumlee's persona, became a constant topic of discussion among fans and the media. His larger-than-life figure, once a defining trademark, started to become a source of insecurity. While initially, Chumlee took the jokes and memes about his weight in stride, over time they began to hurt deeply. What once seemed like harmless entertainment gradually turned into a psychological burden, eroding his self-esteem. The pressure of maintaining a certain image became a heavy burden, even though on the outside, Chumlee continued to project a cheerful demeanor. His internal struggles began to intensify, making him feel weighed down by the very fame he had once embraced. Behind the scenes, Chumlee's rise to fame had led him into a more lavish lifestyle than he had ever imagined. Gifts, endorsement deals, and a life of luxury had thrust him into a world of excess that he now had to navigate. At the same time, his personal life became more complicated than ever, as he found himself unable to manage the mounting pressures from all directions. The temptations of fame, money, and attention not only changed Chumlee's life, but also trapped him in a spiral he couldn't escape. He began to indulge in the luxuries that came with his newfound success: fast cars, expensive clothes, and a lifestyle that was a far cry from the humble beginnings he once knew. The deeper he immersed himself in this glamorous world, the further he distanced himself from the person he once was. No longer just a pawn shop employee, he had become a star, and with that came an unrelenting pressure to maintain this new image. The fame that Chumlee once enjoyed gradually became something he couldn't control. He became addicted to the admiration from the public and the material rewards that came with it. He frequently attended parties, spent time in Las Vegas, and this indulgence further distorted his sense of reality. Drugs and alcohol began to play an inseparable role in Chumlee's life, creating a cycle he couldn't break free from. His family and friends started to notice the obvious changes in him. He was no longer the person they had known before the fame. Chumlee seemed to have become a man torn between two worlds. On one hand, he was still the charming, lovable pawnshop employee that audiences adored. On the other, he was a man struggling to find balance in his life, caught in the whirlwind of fame and poor decisions. The Chumlee viewers saw on television, the cheerful and upbeat one, was now starting to crack under the weight of his own fame. These cracks became more and more apparent. In 2013, Just a few years after the massive success of Pawn Stars, Chumlee made headlines once again, but this time for all the wrong reasons. He was arrested in Las Vegas after a police raid on his home, initially related to a sexual assault investigation. Although no charges were brought in connection with the assault, the police discovered a large collection of unregistered firearms and illegal drugs at Chumlee's residence. The discovery of these items quickly led to felony charges, threatening to destroy both his career and personal life. This marked the beginning of the downfall of the fame Chumlee once enjoyed. The raid brought his personal struggles to light, painting a picture of a man trapped in the dangerous cycle of addiction and making poor decisions. News of the incident spread quickly, and the public began to view Chumlee through a different lens. The charming man from Pawn Stars was no longer the beloved icon, but instead became associated with scandal, crime, and addiction. What once seemed like a life of privilege and success was now slowly unraveling in the most tragic way. The legal proceedings were long and tense, culminating in a public trial where Chumlee faced serious charges. His fate, once uncertain and unclear, began to take shape. The pressure from fame, combined with his personal struggles, had led to this breaking point. It wasn't just the fear of losing his career, money, or freedom, but a deeper realization that the life he had built was actually constructed on an unstable foundation. Fame, once a source of joy and pride, had now become his heaviest burden. As Chumlee's story unfolded, it wasn't just a tragic tale, but a cautionary one about how quickly things can spiral out of control. When fame and fortune collide with inner demons, Chumlee's journey from a beloved television star to a convicted criminal became a stark testament to the immense pressure of living under the public's watchful eye. This is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing oneself in the pursuit of fame. The man who once made millions laugh with his antics on Pawn Stars now had to face the consequences of his actions in a completely different light. As his legal troubles grew and the public's perception of him began to shift, Chumlee's story was far from over. What happened next would open a dark chapter in his life, one marked by regret, reflection, and ultimately, tragedy. The man who had risen from humble beginnings to become a television star was about to discover that fame, although a dream for many, can quickly turn into an inescapable nightmare. March 2016 marked a pivotal moment in Austin Chumlee Russell's life, a day that would forever alter his career, reputation, and personal freedom. For months, Chumlee had lived in a bubble, sheltered by the fame and comforts that come with being a celebrity. But when the police raided his home, that bubble burst, revealing a vulnerable Chumlee in ways he never could have anticipated. It all began with an investigation into an alleged sexual assault, an issue that initially seemed unrelated but quickly developed into a far more damaging inquiry. Law enforcement had begun investigating complaints from an unidentified woman who accused Chumlee of assaulting her at his home. The police then proceeded with their investigation and secured a search warrant for his property. Chumlee, who was used to the public scrutiny, likely never imagined that the search would uncover much more than the initial accusations. But when the police arrived at his Las Vegas home, they found items far beyond what they had anticipated. The raid was swift and methodical. with a team of police officers descending on Chumlee's home in the early morning hours. The television cameras, which had once been his constant companions during his time as a Pawn Stars star, were nowhere to be found. The only ones present were law enforcement officers, tasked with executing the search warrant, and they were about to uncover a darker side of Chumlee's life. At first, Chumlee may have thought the raid was just a minor inconvenience, a legal issue that he would quickly resolve and move past, as he had with many situations in his life before. However, as time passed and the police continued their search, it became clear that this wasn't a routine investigation. The raid quickly expanded beyond the scope of the original inquiry. What had started as a potential sexual assault case soon uncovered a series of other disturbing illegal activities. Among the items found were unregistered firearms, a large quantity of illegal drugs, and several other items that would later become crucial evidence in the case against Chumlee. These discoveries were shocking not only because of the nature of the items found, but also because of who the items were discovered by. Chumlee, once the lovable pawn shop worker and television star, was now tied to a stockpile of weapons and drugs, revealing a much darker side to his lifestyle than anyone could have imagined. The police quickly seized the firearms, drugs, and other illegal items. With each new discovery, Chumlee's world slowly began to crumble. His life, once synonymous with television fame and public admiration, was now marked by serious criminal charges. The consequences of the raid were immediate and harsh. The news of the incident spread within hours, and Chumlee was not only facing the potential destruction of his career, but also the very real possibility of serving time in prison. At first, many of his Pawn Stars fans couldn't believe what they were hearing. Chumlee, the funny and quirky guy they had watched on TV for years, was now the subject of a criminal investigation. The stark contrast between his public image and the events unfolding in the media created a deep sense of cognitive dissonance among those who had once adored him. How could someone who seemed so approachable and innocent on camera become entangled in such a scandalous affair? The charges against Chumlee were extremely serious. He was arrested and faced multiple counts, including the possession of unregistered firearms and the possession of illegal drugs. The drugs found in his home, including marijuana and prescription medications, were not only illegal in Nevada, but also complicated matters further, especially since many of the firearms discovered were not registered. The implications of these charges were truly staggering. If convicted, Chumlee could face decades in prison, depending on the severity of the charges. As the media frenzy surrounding his case escalated, he remained silent, trying to navigate the intense and complex situation. Chumlee was no longer the cheerful, lovable pawnshop employee that fans had come to know. Instead, he had become a man facing serious legal consequences, a reality he had never truly prepared for. The raid on his home marked the beginning of a much larger legal battle, one that would test his resilience in ways he never imagined. Chumlee's legal team immediately began working to negotiate a plea deal. They understood that the charges were extremely serious, but they also recognized the potential influence Chumlee's public image could have. If they could reach the right agreement, Chumlee might avoid the harshest penalties, possibly even avoiding long-term imprisonment. However, with the evidence gathered, including the unregistered firearms and illegal drugs found in his home, the situation was far from straightforward. After the raid, Chumlee became the subject of not only law enforcement investigations, but also intense media scrutiny. The discovery of unregistered weapons in his home made the public question Chumlee's connection to illegal activities. The drugs found in his house painted a clear picture of a man struggling with addiction. As the public learned more about Chumlee's life, the cracks in his character began to show, transforming him from a beloved star into a tragic figure. The celebrity fans once admired was now linked to the criminal underground, and no one knew just how deep his involvement had gone. The image of Chumlee, once a charming and quirky pawnshop employee, had completely changed. He is now a controversial and scandalous figure, and the media wasted no time exploiting his downfall. Stories about Chumlee's legal troubles flooded tabloid newspapers, and social media exploded with reactions from fans and critics alike. Many quickly expressed their disappointment in Chumlee, while others rushed to defend him, arguing that he was a victim of a system that had let him down. The debate about his fate played out in the courtroom of public opinion. Over time, it became clear that Chumlee's future was uncertain. For Chumlee, the raid on his house was a painful wake-up call. He was suddenly forced to face the consequences of the lifestyle he had been living for years. While fame had granted him many privileges, it also created an environment where he couldn't escape his personal demons. The combination of fame, drugs, and the pressure to maintain his public image had taken everything he once had. Now, there were no more distractions. Chumlee's actions had led him down a dangerous path, and there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. As the days turned into weeks, Chumlee's legal team worked tirelessly to prepare his defense. They did everything they could to minimize the severity of the charges, hoping to reach a plea deal that would reduce his sentence. However, Chumlee's reputation had been severely damaged. The bright future in the entertainment industry that he once dreamed of was now overshadowed by the criminal charges he faced. The world that had once admired him was now watching, waiting to see what would happen next in his life. In the months following the raid, Chumlee's personal life continued to spiral downward. The legal battles weighed heavily on him, and the public's perception of him seemed to change with every passing day. His once bright career was now under threat, and no one knew if he would ever return to the world of television. For someone who had once been beloved, the sudden shift from a beloved TV star to a criminal defendant was a huge shock. As the trial proceeded, Chumlee not only had to face the possibility of prison time, but also endured emotional distress, living under constant media scrutiny. He was no longer the funny, approachable man that audiences had come to love through Pawn Stars. Now, he faces severe legal consequences and struggles to come to terms with his actions. The raid on Chumlee's home exposed the darkest secrets of his life. These secrets would follow him for the rest of his days. The discovery of weapons and drugs was just the beginning of an ongoing series of challenges. What happened next would push Chumlee through a series of emotional, legal, and public trials, bringing him closer to the edge. Chumlee's story was no longer just about fame and success. It was now a tale of redemption, survival, and the fight to rebuild a life that had been shattered by his own actions. The events following the police raid on his home were nothing short of a whirlwind. The media frenzy surrounding his arrest intensified with each passing day, and it quickly became clear that the beloved figure from Pawn Stars was now entangled in a grueling legal battle. As the initial shock of the police raid began to subside, the reality of the charges against Chumlee started to crystallize, forcing him and his close ones to confront the consequences of his actions. This marked the beginning of a long and uncertain legal journey, one that would stretch for months and see his life spiral further out of control. The charges against Chumlee were extremely serious, and the evidence collected only added to the severity of his situation. Following the raid, Chumlee faced a range of felony charges, including possession of unregistered firearms, possession of illegal drugs, and several other offenses that could result in him serving a lengthy prison sentence. Although the initial charges primarily involved the weapons and drugs discovered during the search, there remained a lingering concern that the full extent of his criminal activities had yet to be uncovered. The media began speculating about the possible depth of Chumlee's involvement in illicit activities, fueling further public uncertainty and intrigue. People began to wonder if he was connected to larger underground networks that they hadn't yet discovered. Chumlee's legal team immediately shifted into damage control mode. They prioritized assessing the charges, reviewing the evidence, and negotiating a plea deal to mitigate the potential consequences of the criminal charges. However, the reality was that Chumlee was now facing the full weight of the legal system. No matter how hard his legal team worked, the seriousness of the charges could not be ignored. With the looming prospect of a potential 20-year prison sentence hanging over him, Chumlee felt trapped in a nightmare where his fame and public image no longer seemed to offer protection. As the trial date approached, Chumlee's case became a focal point of public attention. The media, always eager for scandals, quickly seized on every new detail about his case. Chumlee's private life, which had once been hidden behind his fame, was now an open book for the public to scrutinize. The fans who once adored him were now forced to question the man they had watched for so many years. The quirky, humorous sidekick of Pawn Stars had now become a criminal defendant, and the public couldn't take their eyes off the unfolding drama. One of the most public aspects of Chumlee's case was the relentless effort of his legal team to negotiate a plea deal. The legal process moved slowly and painfully, with both the defense and prosecution navigating a series of motions, hearings, and discussions. In a high-profile case like Chumlee's, the stakes were incredibly high for everyone involved. Chumlee's legal team knew that a plea deal might be his best chance to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. They worked tirelessly to negotiate a deal that would allow him to receive probation instead of jail time, hoping to avoid the severe consequences of a felony conviction. Chumlee's legal team was well aware of the tough battle they were facing. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Unregistered firearms, a large quantity of illegal drugs, and numerous other illicit items were found in his home. The raid had exposed a level of criminal activity that Chumlee never imagined would be laid bare for the public to see. Nevertheless, his legal team remained focused and persistent, determined to secure the best possible outcome for their client. They understood that every negotiation had to be carefully crafted, as even the smallest mistake could lead to a harsher sentence. As the legal proceedings continued, Chumlee's emotional state worsened. Once a cheerful and carefree figure on Pawn Stars, he now appeared as a man under constant pressure. The weight of facing legal charges, along with the growing attention from the media, had taken a significant toll on Chumlee's mental health. His legal team began to recognize the extent of the stress he was enduring and took steps to address his well-being, understanding that his state of mind could have a profound impact on the case and the negotiations ahead. Others, however, felt betrayed, unable to reconcile the fun, quirky character they once admired with the troubling reality of his legal troubles. The public's divided reaction added another layer of complexity to Chumlee's already turbulent life. On one hand, he was still a beloved figure to many who remembered the laughter he brought to Pawn Stars. On the other hand, there was a growing sense of disappointment and disillusionment from those who had once seen him as a symbol of light-hearted entertainment. The pressure to live up to their expectations while dealing with his own demons became a heavy burden, exacerbating the emotional toll he was under. The stakes were high, and every move he made was scrutinized by both the media and his fans. Meanwhile, others were less forgiving, quickly turning their backs on the man who had once been the beloved pawnshop employee. The constant surveillance caused the public's perception of Chumlee to change in real time. At the same time, Chumlee's legal team continued to work tirelessly to keep him from facing a lengthy prison sentence, negotiating the terms of a plea deal. The overarching question throughout the process was whether Chumlee could avoid a long prison term. The likelihood of him being incarcerated seemed to become an increasingly clear reality, but his legal team knew they had to do everything they could to secure a deal that would allow him to avoid the harshest penalties. The terms of the plea deal were not guaranteed, and the outcome was far from certain. As the days turned into weeks, Chumlee's future remained extremely uncertain. He had begun to face the reality that his life would never be the same again. His television career, once thriving, was now under threat, with the possibility of never returning to the spotlight he had once shone in. The stars of Pawn Stars, the foundation of Chumlee's career, were now just a distant memory. His actions had led him to a point where he could no longer escape the consequences of his behavior. The fame that once brought him luxury and privilege had now become a source of pressure, scrutiny, and judgment. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued to push for a harsh sentence, reflecting the severity of the crimes Chumlee had committed. The unregistered firearms and illegal drugs were serious charges, carrying significant weight in the eyes of the law. The prosecution argued that these charges were not only criminal but also dangerous, as they could pose a threat to others. The plea deal that Chumlee's attorneys were negotiating was an attempt to avoid the harshest penalties, but that didn't mean he would escape conviction without facing time behind bars. As the negotiations continued, Chumlee's legal team grew increasingly concerned about the public perception of the case. The media, with its insatiable hunger for drama, kept fueling the fire. Every new development was reported with sensational headlines, adding more pressure to an already fragile situation. The relentless public scrutiny had a profound impact on Chumlee's mental health, and he began to withdraw. The world he once knew now seemed increasingly distant, and he struggled to cope with the reality of what was at stake. Ultimately, after months of negotiation and legal proceedings, Chumlee's legal team and the prosecution reached a deal. This agreement was a mixed outcome for Chumlee. He would avoid a lengthy prison sentence, but he still faced significant penalties. The court sentenced him to 3 years of probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. This was a far cry from the 20 years in prison he could have faced if the charges were pursued to their fullest extent. but it still presented its own set of challenges. The terms of the probation were very strict, and any violation would result in an immediate prison sentence. Although the legal outcome was much better than what could have happened, the consequences for Chumlee were still very clear. His life, once filled with the thrill of fame, was now a continuous cycle of legal obligations and emotional turmoil. This sentence marked the end of one chapter in Chumlee's life and the beginning of another, where he would have to face the reality of his actions and work to rebuild a life that had been shattered beyond recognition. The legal repercussions for Chumlee had wide-reaching effects, and the personal struggles he had once hidden behind the public image he had crafted were now laid bare for the world to see. Although the legal battle may have ended with a much lighter sentence than expected, the emotional and societal consequences were just beginning. The man who was once a public idol now had to struggle with redemption, and the path ahead was far from clear. He was given a second chance, but this opportunity came with strict conditions. The big question now was whether Chumlee could overcome his past and rebuild his life in the face of immense challenges. The sentencing day arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The case drew attention not only from fans, but also from critics and the media. It was a pivotal moment, and the outcome would determine the fate of Austin Russell, better known as Chumlee, the star of Pawn Stars. This would be a day that would forever mark the end of his public life and the beginning of an uncertain future, one in which he could not escape the consequences of his poor choices and criminal actions. Chumlee, who had spent months preparing for this day, sat quietly in the courtroom, flanked by his legal team. The man who was once confident and carefree, the face of a hit television show, now appeared withdrawn and almost fragile. He had weathered the storm of public scrutiny, faced the relentless attention of the media, and carried the immense weight of criminal charges against him. But today, it was time to face the truth. The sentence would mark the culmination of months of legal battles, continuous media coverage, and personal calculations that had upended Chumlee's life. The courtroom buzzed with conversations and whispers as Chumlee's family and friends took their seats. The room was filled with emotions of anxiety, restlessness, and, in some cases, skepticism. How could a man, once adored by millions, end up here, facing the prospect of prison? His fans, who had followed his every move on Pawn Stars, struggled to reconcile the image of the cheerful, lovable character they saw on TV with the man standing before them now. The contrast between these two images was stark, and it was impossible to ignore. The judge entered the courtroom, bringing the proceedings to order. Chumlee stood before the court, head bowed in silence, waiting for the verdict that would determine his future. His legal team had worked tirelessly to secure a favorable plea deal, hoping that the severity of the charges could be mitigated by his lack of prior convictions and his genuine remorse for his actions. However, the nature of the crimes, unregistered firearms, and illegal drugs was undeniably serious. The judge would have to weigh both the legal implications and the emotional weight of the case. As the judge began to speak, the room fell into a deep silence. Everyone in the courtroom was acutely aware that this moment was not just the downfall of a television star, but the reckoning with the consequences of poor decisions. This is the story of a man who made choices that placed him on the wrong side of the law, and now he must face the consequences. The judge outlined the charges against Chumlee, including the possession of unregistered firearms, illegal drugs, and the severity of these offenses. The legal implications were clear. These were serious charges with the potential for a lengthy prison sentence. The judge also took into account mitigating factors in Chumlee's case, such as his cooperation with law enforcement during the investigation, his expressed remorse, and his lack of a prior criminal record. Despite these mitigating factors, the sentence could still be harsh. The prosecution continued to argue for a significant prison sentence, emphasizing the seriousness of the charges. They pointed out that the unregistered firearms were not only illegal, but also posed a potential danger to public safety. The drugs found in Chumlee's possession indicated a pattern of behavior beyond simple possession, suggesting signs of addiction and involvement in criminal activities. The prosecution's stance reflected the gravity of the situation, reinforcing the argument for a long period of incarceration. The prosecution's message was clear. Chumlee's actions had consequences, and those consequences needed to be felt by both him and society. They emphasized that his criminal behavior was not just a personal mistake, but had a serious impact on the community. On the other hand, Chumlee's defense attorneys fought for him to receive leniency from the court. They focused on his positive contributions to the community, his public image, and the fact that he had no prior criminal record. Chumlee's lawyers argued that while he had made a grave mistake, he was genuinely remorseful and willing to do whatever it took to make amends for his wrongs. The defense also highlighted the emotional toll the case had taken on him, as well as the public repercussions he had faced, which had profoundly impacted both his career and personal life. They urged the court to issue a sentence that would allow Chumlee to continue his path toward rehabilitation and reintegration into society. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the judge weighed both sides of the argument. For Chumlee, this was a pivotal moment in his legal journey, a moment when he would find out if his efforts to make amends were enough to secure a lenient sentence. As he stood before the judge, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He had made mistakes, big ones, but he also knew that he had a chance to rebuild his life, and that chance was now in the judge's hands. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. The verdict was read aloud, and the room fell silent once more. The verdict was a mixed sentence. Chumlee was sentenced to 3 years of probation, mandatory community service, and counseling. It was a far cry from the 20 years that had seemed doable, but still challenging. The judge made it clear that the terms of probation would be strict. Any violation of the terms would result in immediate incarceration. It was a sentence that required Chumlee to face the full consequences of his actions, while also giving him a chance at redemption. The relief on Chumlee's face was palpable, but there was also a bleak realization that his life was now on a different trajectory. The sentence he received was not a victory, but a second chance to rebuild, learn from his mistakes, and prove that he could turn his life around. However, it was also a reminder that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Chumlee would have to overcome the challenges of probation, complete his community service, and seek help for the issues that contributed to his downfall. The road wasn't easy, but it was his chance to truly change. The court gave Chumlee a chance, but he had to make the most of it. As Chumlee left the courtroom, his supporters had mixed reactions. Some were relieved that he avoided a lengthy prison sentence, while others were disappointed that he wasn't held more accountable for his actions. Regardless of their opinions, one thing was clear: Chumlee's life would never be the same. The man who had once been a star on Pawn Stars was now a man searching for redemption. He had been given a second chance, but was fully aware that it could slip away if he failed to meet the terms of his probation. In the days that followed, Chumlee began to reflect on the sentence he had just received. It was a reminder of the choices he had made and the consequences that came with them, but it was also an opportunity to take control of his future and begin the process of rebuilding his life. The journey would not be easy, but it was the only way forward for a man who had lost everything and was now determined to regain what he could. As the public continued to watch, Chumlee's story became one of both caution and hope. It served as a reminder that even those who seem to have it all can fall. But it was also a story of redemption, the possibility that even the most broken lives can be rebuilt. For Chumlee, the sentence wasn't just an end, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter that would be challenging, yes, but also full of potential for growth, healing, and ultimately, salvation. The weeks and months following his sentencing would be among the hardest of his life. For a man who once lived in the spotlight, surrounded by cameras, fans, and public attention, the reality of his current circumstances feels brutally harsh. The world Chumlee once knew, the world of Pawn Stars and endless opportunities, is now just a distant memory. What remains is a man struggling to come to terms with his new reality, grappling with past mistakes, and facing an uncertain future. The image of Chumlee, carefully crafted over years on television, has now shattered, replaced by the weight of legal obligations, public scrutiny, and the personal demons he must confront. Chumlee spent years building his image as the lovable, goofy sidekick on Pawn Stars. His humor and larger-than-life personality made him a household name, with fans tuning in weekly to see his antics at the pawn shop. But the public persona he worked so hard to craft was merely a surface layer. Beneath it, Chumlee was struggling in ways that few people truly understood. The pressure of fame, the need to maintain his image, and the personal insecurities he harbored created a perfect storm of internal conflict. Sitting in his apartment reflecting on the events that led to his downfall, Chumlee couldn't help but wonder where everything had gone wrong. He started with the best of intentions, never seeking fame. It came to him, fueled by a reality TV show that would change his life forever. At first, the attention was flattering, and he relished the perks of being a TV star, meeting celebrities, signing endorsement deals, and basking in the admiration of millions. But over time, the attention became more intense. The pressure to live up to the expectations of fans and the public began to have significant consequences. The man who was once the carefree pawnshop employee was now weighed down by the overwhelming weight of the mistakes he had made. The addiction to fame, which initially seemed like a harmless indulgence, quickly turned into something much darker. Chumlee had always struggled with his weight, body image, and self-esteem. These internal battles were sometimes played for laughs on the show, but behind the scenes, they were the source of deep, persistent pain. The media, fans, and even his co-workers often made jokes about his appearance, amplifying the insecurities that plagued him. Although Chumlee initially accepted these comments, they soon began to have a profound effect on him. He started turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms, drugs and alcohol, to numb the pain. What began as a way to deal with the pressures of fame ultimately turned into a full-blown addiction. It wasn't just his appearance he had to struggle with. It was his sense of self-worth. As his fame grew, so did the feeling that he was losing touch with his true self. The character of Chumlee on television was very different from the person he was in real life. The gap between these two versions of himself began to create a deep internal discord. He had become a character the world adored, yet he was someone he no longer recognized in the mirror. The pressure to maintain the image of the cheerful, lovable Chumlee grew suffocating, and the more he tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped through his fingers. In the years leading up to the raid, Chumlee became increasingly isolated. He surrounded himself with people who enabled his behavior, those who told him what he wanted to hear and never challenged him when he made poor decisions. He found himself trapped in a cycle of indulgence, self-doubt, and fear. These habits only worsened his situation. Drugs, alcohol, and partying became his escape from the pressure of being Chumlee, but they were also the very things slowly destroying him. He distanced himself from friends, family, and colleagues who had once been by his side. As his addiction deepened, the walls around him grew higher, making it harder for him to see a way out. His isolation became more pronounced as his destructive actions pushed him further away from everything he once held dear. When the police raid happened, it felt as though everything he had tried to conceal was immediately exposed. The illegal guns, the drug stash. These were just physical manifestations of the chaos inside that he had struggled with for years. His life had been like a carefully constructed facade, but in one swift blow, it all came crashing down, leaving him to face the reality he had been running from. The raid was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of how far Chumlee had fallen and the damage he had caused. But even as the legal weight pressed down on him, Chumlee couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped. The future seemed bleak, and the pressure to fix everything felt like an insurmountable burden. In the weeks following his sentencing, he struggled to come to terms with his situation. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to avoid prison time, but it came with conditions. His probation terms were strict, and he was required to undergo counseling, complete community service, and adhere to a set of rules that felt suffocating. But despite these conditions, Chumlee couldn't help but wonder if he could truly change. His internal struggles, addiction, insecurity, and need for acceptance couldn't be easily resolved with a court sentence. He had a long road ahead and knew that the battle wasn't just in the courtroom, it was also in his mind, in those quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. The emotional toll of the case had begun to deeply affect Chumlee's mental health. If you found this interesting, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support this video, as well as help spread the message of healing and change. Together, we can change the way we perceive and support those facing similar challenges. Chumlee had always relied on humor to cope with difficult situations, but the gravity of his legal troubles and the public's reaction to his arrest made him feel deeply isolated. The very public who once admired him now seemed to judge him at every turn. Harsh comments on social media, coupled with unforgiving news articles, made him feel disconnected from the world he once knew. For the first time in his life, Chumlee felt as though he no longer had control over the narrative of his own story. Sitting in his small apartment, reflecting on his life, Chumlee began to consider what the future might hold. The idea of returning to television seemed impossible. The world that had once embraced him now felt distant, and he wasn't sure if he could ever return to that life. What he had built over the years was gone, and it was unclear whether he could regain his place in the eyes of the public. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his future wasn't just about fame. It was about healing not just for himself, but also for the people he had hurt along the way. Addiction, poor decisions, and legal troubles were all symptoms of a deeper issue, an issue Chumlee had to confront if he wanted to find peace within himself. The court-mandated counseling sessions became a turning point for him. For the first time in a long while, he had to face the root causes of his struggles in life. The counseling sessions weren't easy. He was forced to confront the pain of his past, the traumas that had shaped him, and the fears that had driven him to make poor choices. It was a painful process, but it also marked the beginning of his awakening to the possibility of change. The road to recovery wouldn't be easy, but it was a path he was finally ready to walk. Ultimately, Chumlee's inner struggles were not something easily overcome. They were an integral part of who he was, and they would always be with him. But the journey of healing had begun. With each step, he found himself growing stronger, a little more self-aware. His future remained uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, Chumlee was ready to face it head-on. After his sentencing, he found himself thrust into a completely new world, a world that was in stark contrast to the TV screens, the bright lights, and the fame he had once known. The days of being the star of Pawn Stars, the man who made audiences laugh with his antics, were behind him. Instead, he was now a convicted felon, his name forever linked to criminal charges and a public scandal that seemed to tarnish every aspect of his life. The life that awaited him was now confined behind bars, a far cry from the luxury and celebrity he had once known. This was the price he had to pay for his actions. Chumlee was taken to a local detention facility, a stark contrast to the comfort he had enjoyed just a few months before. The reality of being in jail was something he had never truly prepared for. Reading about it or hearing stories from others was one thing, but experiencing it firsthand was an entirely different reality. The small, cold, and barren cell was a stark contrast to the life he had lived in the world of celebrity. His days were no longer filled with the hustle of filming or the laughter of colleagues. Now there was only silence, punctuated by the occasional footsteps echoing down the hallway. At first, Chumlee found himself struggling with the overwhelming isolation. The transition from a life of public adoration to a life behind bars was harder than he had imagined. The admiration from fans, the constant buzz from social media, and the sense of controlling his own narrative had all completely vanished. Instead, he felt alone, surrounded by individuals from all walks of life. Some had become hardened by their criminal records, while others were just as lost as he was. The first few days in prison were a chaotic mix of confusion and fear. Chumlee, who had once been so accustomed to the cameras, now found himself avoiding them. His face now looked nothing like the cheerful personality that fans had come to love. His previous experiences with fame had prepared him for many things, but nothing had prepared him for the harsh reality of life behind bars. The weight of his circumstances bore down on him every day. The cold room, bland food, and every minute seemed to stretch on endlessly. Perhaps the hardest part was the mental and emotional toll of being torn away from the world he once knew. Chumlee didn't take long to realize that prison wasn't just physical confinement. It was an ongoing mental and emotional battle. He had spent much of his life pretending to be someone he wasn't. Now he was forced to face his true self, the man who had made the decisions that led him here, the man he could no longer escape. There were no cameras in his cell, no audience to perform for, and no way to hide behind a character. It was only Chumlee, the fallen man, trying to find meaning in his life. As the days passed, Chumlee began to adapt to the new rhythm of life behind bars. Life wasn't easy. There were moments when he felt like a complete failure, questioning whether he would ever overcome this challenge. The isolation was the hardest part. Chumlee was no longer the man surrounded by friends and fans. He now had to face the truth that his life had changed forever, and he could never return to the glory days of the past. Instead, Chumlee was just another prisoner struggling to comprehend a world that seemed so foreign to him. No jokes, no laughter, no witty remarks to break the tension. It was just him, the walls, and the silent echoes of his own thoughts. At first, Chumlee struggled with sleep. The stillness of the cell was suffocating, and the nights seemed endless. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the events that had led him here. The raid, the arrest, the trial, the sentence. Every choice he had made seemed to culminate in this moment, and the weight of it all was suffocating. He thought about the man he used to be, carefree, charming, full of life, and wondered where that person had gone. How did he end up here, in this place so far removed from the life he once knew? As the weeks passed, Chumlee began to find small ways to cope with his new reality. He started participating in group activities, trying to keep his mind busy. He spent time reading books, journaling, and reflecting on things he had once taken for granted in his former life. But it wasn't just the physical routines that helped him carry on. It was the slow, painful process of self-reflection that began to shift his perspective. Every day he thought about the mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt, and the path that had led him to this moment. He wasn't just serving time for illegal possession of weapons and drugs. He was serving time for the years of poor decisions, addiction, and emotional scars buried deep inside him. Despite the hardships, Chumlee began to realize that there was an opportunity for growth. The prison environment, though harsh, provided him with the space to reflect on the choices that had led him here. It wasn't a pleasant process, but it was necessary. He had spent most of his life running from the truth, hiding behind his fame and distractions. Now, for the first time, he had to face the reality of who he was and what he had done. Other prisoners in the facility gave Chumlee a mirror, a reflection of a side of himself he hadn't noticed in a long time. These confrontations with his true self were becoming an important part of his recovery journey. Many of the people around Chumlee were hardened criminals, individuals who had spent years going in and out of prison. But there were also others like him who found themselves trapped in a system they didn't know how to navigate. The shared experiences of struggling with addiction, broken relationships, and the consequences of bad choices forged a bond between Chumlee and those around him. It wasn't the kind of connection he had expected, but it was the connection that helped him start to understand the depth of his own struggles. The court-mandated counseling sessions became an essential part of Chumlee's journey in prison. These sessions forced him to confront his past head-on, digging into issues like addiction, self-esteem, and the pressures of fame that had shaped his life. The therapy wasn't easy. He had to work through years of denial, guilt, and shame. But in doing so, Chumlee began to understand the root causes of his actions. Fame was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it had given him everything he had ever wanted. On the other, it had nurtured the darkest parts of his character, reinforcing the fears and insecurities he had buried deep within. Through therapy, Chumlee began to develop coping strategies to handle his emotions and the overwhelming pressures of being in prison. It wasn't just about managing the daily struggles of life behind bars. It was about addressing the deeper emotional scars that had shaped his behavior. The counseling sessions helped him realize that his path to recovery wouldn't be a quick fix. It would take time, effort, and commitment to change. But for the first time in a long while, Chumlee felt like he was finally moving in the right direction. The man who had once been trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and addiction was now starting to see the possibility of a different life, one where he could heal and move forward. Even as he worked toward recovery, Chumlee still faced constant reminders of his past. The public scrutiny didn't stop when he entered prison. The media continued to track his every move, sensationalizing his case and adding to the pressure he was already feeling. The public was watching, waiting to see whether he would succeed in his journey of redemption or fail and fade into obscurity. It was a reality that Chumlee couldn't escape. But as the days passed, he began to realize that the only person he needed to prove something to was himself. He couldn't change the past, but he could control how he moved forward. Over time, life behind bars began to feel more ordinary. It was a life filled with challenges, but it also provided him with the opportunity to rebuild, reflect, and heal. He was no longer the man he was before the raid, and he was no longer the man who had been thrown into prison. He was someone in between, a man who had made mistakes but was determined to find his way back. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Chumlee believed redemption was possible. The weeks turned into months, and life behind bars began to take on a painful rhythm. Each day felt like a battle to stay grounded as he faced the harsh reality of his circumstances. He was no longer the star of a hit television show. He was just another prisoner, struggling not only with the physical confinement of prison, but also with the emotional and mental imprisonment that seemed to have overwhelmed him. He had made significant progress in his personal recovery, attending counseling sessions, staying out of trouble, and reflecting deeply on the mistakes that had led him to this point. However, despite these efforts, there was still an underlying sense of hopelessness that he couldn't escape. The public's gaze was always upon him. Every day he had to face a reminder of the man he once was, the beloved figure on Pawn Stars, the man who had brought joy to millions of fans. The weight of that legacy was ever present in his mind. Fame, which once seemed like a wonderful gift, now felt like a curse. It was an anchor, pulling him back to a life he could never return to. Even as he tried to rebuild himself in the isolation of his cell, he couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. The decisions he had made, the addictions he had battled, and the mistakes he had been a part of were now deeply ingrained in the fabric of his life. Chumlee's emotional journey was one filled with turmoil. He had spent years running from the demons within him, burying his insecurities, fears, and regrets beneath layers of humor, fame, and indulgence. But now, behind bars, he had no choice but to face them head-on. Drug addiction, alcohol, and a life of excess had come with consequences. The hardest battle was always the one inside his mind. Every day he wondered if redemption was possible. Did he have a chance to rebuild his life? Or was he doomed to live with the consequences of his actions in a way that would shape the rest of his life? As the days passed, Chumlee's emotional state became more fragile. His thoughts often turned to those he had hurt: his family, friends, and even the fans who had once supported him. He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for the damage he had caused, not just in his own life, but in the lives of those around him. The people who had once been part of his world, the colleagues at Pawn Stars, the film crew who had made the show, and even his fans were all affected by the scandal surrounding his arrest and the ensuing media circus. It weighed heavily on him. He couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. No matter how hard he tried, the isolation in prison, coupled with the mental and emotional wounds, began to wear him down. Chumlee had spent years living in the public eye, surrounded by constant attention to the point that the absence of that attention in prison was deafening. Chumlee could no longer hide behind his television persona, and that forced him to confront the raw, vulnerable man he had long kept hidden. He was no longer the character on Pawn Stars. He was simply Austin Russell, a man who had made a series of bad choices, had to pay the price, and now had to find a way to make amends. During this intense internal struggle, Chumlee began to consider the possibility that he might not survive this ordeal. His emotional state deteriorated further. The despair he felt, combined with loneliness and guilt, made him question whether he could keep going. For someone who had spent years living in the thrill of fame, the quiet, oppressive nature of prison was suffocating. There was no escape from his pain, no way to escape the weight of his thoughts. The counseling sessions and group activities were helpful, but they only provided temporary relief. The deep sense of shame and guilt he carried was a constant companion, one that he couldn't shake. Chumlee's final days in prison were marked by an increasing sense of desperation. Despite receiving support from counselors and fellow inmates, the reality of his circumstances began to take a toll on Chumlee's mental health. He had spent months trying to come to terms with his actions, to make amends, and to find a path to redemption. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the weight of the world seemed unbearable. On one fateful day, Chumlee's internal struggles reached a breaking point. The emotional pain that had built up inside him for so long became too much to bear. The isolation, shame, guilt, and overwhelming pressure of his circumstances came to a tragic climax in a heartbreaking moment. With no one around to intervene, no one to stop him, Chumlee made the decision to end his life. It was a desperate act, a final plea for release from the mental anguish that had consumed him. In his cell, Chumlee fashioned a noose from a shirt, and in that deeply sorrowful moment, he took his own life. The news of his death would soon echo through the media, shocking his fans, family, and all who had known him. The man who had made the world laugh, who had captured the hearts of millions, was now gone. His legacy was marked not just by fame, but by tragedy. Chumlee's death left a profound impact on those who had known him. Even fans of Pawn Stars struggled to reconcile the image of him on television with the reality of his life behind closed doors. His colleagues who had worked alongside him on the show were also left in shock. The loss of Chumlee was not just the departure of a television character, but the departure of a real person, someone who had battled his own demons for many years. The shock waves from his death spread throughout the entertainment world, leaving a deep sense of sorrow in the hearts of those closest to him. For Chumlee's family and friends, the news was heart-wrenching. His parents, who had witnessed their son rise to fame and success, now had to endure the immense loss. They had done everything they could to support him, but in the end, they were unable to stop his downward spiral, unable to save him from that tragic fate. As the media began to report the details of Chumlee's life, many opinions surfaced regarding the reasons behind his death. Some people believed that he had become too addicted to fame and the immense pressures of living under the constant scrutiny of the public. Others argued that the harsh environment of prison, coupled with the emotional and mental wounds he carried, had pushed him to the brink. Whatever the cost, one thing was certain. Chumlee's death was a tragedy, a stark reminder of the fragility of fame and the dark price it can exact. After his passing, discussions began to emerge about how society and the entertainment industry view the struggles faced by those in the public eye. Fame could be both a gift and a curse for Chumlee. It gave him the world, but at the same time, it took everything from him. Chumlee's tragic end is a stark reminder of the pressures that come with fame and the importance of providing mental health support for those living under the spotlight. After his death, one question lingered. Was there anything that could have been done to save him? The answer perhaps lies in a broader conversation about mental health and addiction, especially in the context of fame. Chumlee struggled with both, and his heartbreaking end serves as a reminder that even those who seem to have it all can be suffering on the inside. After Chumlee's tragic death, the conversation surrounding his life and legacy shifted to a much more complex direction. Once a beloved figure, prominent on Pawn Stars, his sudden passing left a profound void, not only in the world of reality television but also in the hearts of millions of viewers. The man who once made audiences laugh uncontrollably with his wit, humor, and larger-than-life personality was now gone. All that remained were the memories of a public figure who once shone brightly and the haunting question of what really happened. Chumlee's legacy became a mix of fame, regret, and redemption possibilities that were never fully realized. As the world mourned his passing, many began to stop and reflect on his life, trying to understand how a man who seemingly had everything fame, money, and admiration could end up on such a tragic path. Fans of Pawn Stars were forced to confront the heartbreaking truth that the cheerful, down-to-earth man they had come to love on their reality screens had been battling deep personal demons. It was these internal struggles that led him down a dark, tragic path. The media didn't shy away from Chumlee's story, offering assessments that were both sympathetic and sharply judgmental. For many, Chumlee's death was the ultimate tragedy of fame, the steep price one must pay for mental health when living under the immense pressure of the public eye. The loneliness and lack of genuine support while being in the spotlight led him into an unbreakable spiral. In many ways, Chumlee became a symbol of the shallowness and superficiality that fame can bring. It was fame that took him to the heights, but ultimately it was the very thing that destroyed him. Addiction to fame, compounded by his long battle with substance abuse and the emotional scars of living under the public's gaze, gradually eroded who he was. However, even as his life story ended in tragedy, the question of Chumlee's legacy remains difficult to answer. Was his life truly defined only by fame and the mistakes he made along the way? Or was there something deeper beneath the scandals and tragedies he faced? For those who truly knew him, the answer was far from simple. While Chumlee's mistakes may have led to his downfall, those who were close to him remembered a man with a kind heart, someone who always tried to bring joy to those around him, despite his character flaws. His humor, laughter, and ability to connect with others were the qualities that made Chumlee one of the most beloved figures on Pawn Stars. Even in the darkest moments of his life, there remained a part of Chumlee that was kind-hearted, genuine, and deeply human. However, despite the affection from fans and friends, Chumlee's death highlighted the struggles that celebrities face, especially those who gain attention at a very young age. The pressure of fame, the constant public scrutiny, and the sense of helplessness in escaping others' expectations deeply affected Chumlee's ability to cope with life's challenges. His struggles serve as a reminder that fame cannot protect a person from mental health issues, addiction, or the emotional pain that anyone, regardless of their status, can experience. If there is anything to be learned from Chumlee's story, it is the amplification of personal issues in the world of fame. The challenges he faced became harder to address when everything was magnified under the public's watchful eye. Fame can exacerbate problems, making the path to healing more complicated than ever. Chumlee's legacy after his passing became a cautionary tale and a call for compassion. His story serves as a reminder of the dangers of losing oneself in the pursuit of fame. However, it also serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of mental health, recovery from addiction, and the need for compassion and understanding from those around us. Chumlee, despite his public persona, had quietly battled his inner demons for many years. His story is not just about fame or downfall, but about the silent struggles that many people face but feel too ashamed to share. After his death, there have been strong calls to change the way we perceive and treat the mental health of celebrities so that no one has to suffer in silence. Chumlee's story highlights the importance of providing meaningful support to those caught in the whirlwind of public life. The media, once quick to celebrate him, now has a responsibility to reflect on the toxic aspects of fame and the steep price it demands from individuals. No longer just a sensational story or the next scandal, Chumlee's story serves as a reminder to address the deeper issues that always lie beneath the surface of the glamorous life of fame. For those who knew Chumlee, His death was a loss not just of a friend, but of a family member, someone who always brought love and had a kind, genuine heart. They remember him not for the accusations or the mistakes that occurred, but for the laughter he brought, brightening their lives. Chumlee was someone who could make people smile, even on the darkest days. His humor, larger-than-life personality, and ability to connect with others were qualities that those who loved him will forever remember, even as the media moves on to new headlines. Chumlee's family, especially his parents, faced the complex pain of witnessing their son rise to fame only to crumble in front of the public eye. They had to navigate their own feelings of sadness and regret about what had happened. Questions about whether they could have done more to help their son, or whether there was something they had missed along the way, haunted them. The guilt of not being able to prevent his collapse during his darkest moments weighed heavily on their hearts. However, they also recognized that Chumlee was not the only one who had to endure the immense pressures that fame brings. He was a victim of the same forces that have affected so many other celebrities. Despite the boundless love and support from his family, none of them could stop the downward spiral of fame that had overtaken Chumlee. It was something beyond anyone's control, no matter how hard they tried. However, Chumlee's story is not just one about forgiveness. His tragic end has become a powerful catalyst for change in the way society views and addresses mental health and addiction in the entertainment industry. Chumlee's death sparked important conversations about the need for a better support system for celebrities, one that focuses not just on their physical health, but also on their mental and emotional well-being. In the years following his passing, many efforts have been made to address the mental health challenges faced by public figures. Programs and dedicated resources have been launched to help stars navigate the immense pressures that come with fame, offering them the tools and support to cope with the emotional toll. Chumlee's death also sparked a strong wave of support from his fans, many of whom had only known him through the footage on screen. To them, Chumlee was a symbol of joy, a figure who brought light into their homes every week. The mourning was not just the loss of a celebrity, but the loss of a person they admired and cherished. Chumlee's story to them became a reminder to show more compassion toward those they follow, realizing that celebrities are human too, with their own struggles and challenges. The idea that fame can lead to tragedy has become a wake-up call for the public. Chumlee's story encourages a more compassionate approach to celebrities, especially during their difficult times. While Chumlee's life ended in tragedy, his story left a lasting legacy, sparking deep conversations and shifting the awareness of the pressures public figures face in the spotlight. Chumlee's journey is a complex one, marked by fame, addiction, self-doubt, and the possibility of redemption. It was an imperfect yet meaningful life, highlighting both the dangers of fame and the potential for personal growth. Although his life ended too soon, his journey made a significant impact, sparking conversations and changing the way we view the pressures of public life. Chumlee's legacy is not defined by his downfall, but by his humanity, a man who always tried to bring joy to those around him. Chumlee's story will forever serve as a reminder of the importance of understanding the complexities of fame and the price one pays when living in the public spotlight. It also serves as a reminder of the need to show compassion for those who are struggling in silence, facing issues that sometimes no one else knows about. The consequences of Chumlee's tragic passing left a deep mark not only on his family and friends, but also on the millions of fans who followed his journey on Pawn Stars. Chumlee's death, though shrouded in sorrow and regret, has become a point of reflection not just for those close to him, but for society as a whole. The question of how someone seemingly happy, beloved, and successful could fall so deeply has opened up difficult yet important conversations about fame, mental health, and the darker side of public life. Chumlee's story, though ending in tragedy, has helped the public gain a deeper understanding of the challenges that celebrities face, encouraging a shift in how we view and treat those who suffer in silence. Chumlee's family struggled with the complex emotions of grief, guilt, and loss. His parents, who had witnessed their son grow from a shy, awkward teenager into a television star, now had to confront an unimaginable tragedy, the loss of their son, under such heartbreaking circumstances. They knew that Chumlee had struggled with addiction and mental health issues, but they never imagined those struggles could lead to such a painful ending. Their pain was compounded by the sense of helplessness in witnessing a loved one suffer in silence without being able to help. Despite their unwavering love and support, they were unable to stop the downward spiral that ultimately took Chumlee's life. The emotional weight of the loss wasn't just about the man who had passed, but also about the life he could have had. A life where he might have overcome his demons, found peace, and reclaimed the joy he once had. After Chumlee's death, his family found themselves grappling with painful questions. Could they have done more to help him? Were there signs they missed? Were there moments when they could have intervened to prevent him from falling down the path that led to this tragedy? These questions were not only familiar to Chumlee's family, but also to anyone who has lost a loved one to addiction or mental health issues. The agony of not being able to save someone you love is an incredibly heavy burden to bear. For Chumlee's family, the answers to these questions remain elusive. Meanwhile, the media, which had once elevated Chumlee to star status, now focused their attention on his death. The public, after a period of shock and curiosity, began to react strongly. Fans, who had once admired him, now mourned the loss of someone they had considered a close friend. Chumlee, who had been a constant presence on television for many years, had become a symbol of warmth and a larger-than-life personality. Someone who made people laugh and helped them forget the struggles of their own lives. However, the tragedy of his death revealed the fragility of the image he had built. The smiling man on television was ultimately just someone who had to struggle with the very human problems and challenges that many of us face. That cheerful persona was, in reality, just a facade for a person battling inner turmoil. The media quickly sensationalized the tragic circumstances of Chumlee's death, as they often do with high-profile figures. Headlines reported the details of his passing, and the public was left sifting through information in an attempt to understand what led him to make such a painful and brutal decision. The unanswered questions surrounding the reasons and circumstances of his death forced the public to reflect more deeply on the issues that celebrities face. The sensational nature of the news only fueled more speculation about the cause of Chumlee's death, further burdening his family with emotional weight. However, amidst the chaos of the media coverage, there was a deeper story that needed to be told. It was the story of the price fame exacts on mental health, the isolation that comes with constant public scrutiny, and the urgent need to change how we approach the well-being of those who live under the unrelenting gaze of the public eye. As fans and colleagues mourned Chumlee's passing, many began to reflect on the deeper implications of his story. His death served as a clear reminder of the importance of mental health awareness, especially for those in the entertainment industry. Over the years, Chumlee had been the subject of jokes, memes, and public comments. His weight, sense of humor, and role on Pawn Stars had made him a well-known figure, someone everyone recognized. Chumlee's time on Pawn Stars brought joy to millions, and his humor and kindness left a lasting impression on those who knew him. After his death, many took the time to reflect on the positive memories he left behind. Those who worked with him on the show remembered his infectious laughter, his willingness to help, and the warmth he brought to the set. For fans, Chumlee was a source of entertainment, a constant companion in their homes. And while his death marks a tragic end to a life that seemed full of promise, it also serves as a reminder of the joy he brought to so many. Chumlee will always be remembered not only for his struggles, but also for the bright moments he shared with others throughout his journey. Over time, Chumlee's legacy will be defined not just by his standout moments on Pawn Stars, but also by a profound story of caution and redemption. His story is a powerful reminder that fame, while bringing many rewards, also carries hidden costs that not everyone immediately sees. Chumlee's passing, though sudden and tragic, highlighted an important issue: the need to pay more attention to mental health, not just for celebrities, but for society as a whole. His death didn't just close the story of a television star, but it opened up an important dialogue about psychological support and how the public and the entertainment industry can change the way they perceive and approach those facing personal struggles. Chumlee's legacy has now become a reminder to change the way we view those in the entertainment industry, especially in the context of mental health. It encourages everyone, whether famous or not, to face life's challenges without fear, while also calling for understanding and empathy from the community. While Chumlee's death was a tragic end, his legacy opens the door to a more compassionate approach to the struggles faced by those living under the spotlight. Yes, we've explored the legacy and lessons from Chumlee's life together, haven't we? What do you think about the mental health challenges that entertainment stars face under the spotlight? If you believe we need to change the way we perceive and treat celebrities, leave a 1 in the comments below. And if you think Chumlee's story needs to be shared to help others understand better, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to support this video. Remember to share stories, compassion, and love with those around you. Thank you for watching.